All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michaela Coogan. I'm a member fulfillment specialist here at WiscNet, along with my colleague Ivor. I wanted to start off by saying thank you all so much for being with us today. Cass Hill has an informative session for us, but quick before that, wanted to do a quick few housekeeping things. Today's session is going to be recorded and emailed to all registrants. And we'll be leaving some time at the end for questions. But if you have any, please drop them in the chat and Cass will answer them either in the moment or at the end. But with that, I'll hand things over to Cass.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michaela, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So my name is Cass Hill and I use she, her pronouns. I am a white, middle-aged woman with short brown hair, and I am at my home office. I have a background of the City of Madison on my screen, and I'm wearing a black sleeveless top. And I'm really happy to be with you today. So when we talk about digital inclusion, the reason that I called this session Recommitting to Digital Inclusion is because I imagine that most of the folks who are joining us today have either a personal value system that aligns with digital inclusion and or do work that is associated with digital inclusion. And some of you may be doing those things in ways that you don't realize. So as we have our conversation today, I want us to sort of focus on what it is that we do, what does digital inclusion mean, where we are, and then where we're going with digital inclusion, what the future of digital inclusion could possibly look like. So again, Cass Hill, I am the City of Madison's Digital Inclusion Coordinator. I am housed in IT. I work very closely with Sarah Edgerton, and my role at the city is kind of twofold. One portion of my role is making sure that all that we're doing as a city in terms of digital government is accessible, comfortable, and secure for our residents. Part of that is also focusing on the technologies that we use to provide those services to residents. And so another portion of my role is to make sure that our workforce is keeping pace and that we're not leaving anyone in the workforce behind as we adopt new technologies. I do want to highlight for today that comments or questions are welcome. This is actually my first opportunity to present here for the folks at WiscNet. I was at the WiscNet conference this year and I really enjoyed it. And I met a lot of folks who were doing really important things around Wisconsin and in their communities. And so please feel empowered to participate. You can either raise your virtual hand here in the Zoom, or you can pop your question into chat and feel free to pipe in if it's for some reason not been noticed, but I do invite that today. So a quick poll, if everyone could. First of all, can I get a thumbs up from everybody that you are here, you're able to hear me okay, and that everything on the screen in terms of the slides is working all right for you? All right, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Fantastic. Okay. So if you would be willing to just pop into the chat, on a scale from 1 to 10, for the folks that are joining us today, I'd love to hear or read about your knowledge and or practice of digital inclusion. And I'm doing this at the beginning because I have a lot that we could cover today, but I want to make sure that what we do talk about is actually relevant to the folks who are here and engaging with the topic today. So do me a favor in the chat, scale of 1 to 5. Rate your knowledge and or practice of digital inclusion, right? With 1 being, I know sort of about it, but I don't really engage with it very much, all the way to maybe you're someone who knows a lot about digital inclusion and practices it in your regular workplace or life. And I'll wait for folks to pop that into the chat. All right, so what I'm seeing in the chat, fantastic. Thank you, everyone. I'm seeing a lot of responses that are leaning towards maybe having heard about digital inclusion and what it might include, but not necessarily really having it embedded in their daily lives or daily practice. So what that means is that what I'd like to do today is focus on some foundational information about what digital inclusion is, where we have been in digital inclusion, what the landscape looked like, and then just in the last few years, where we've ended up today. And then if we have time, I have some best practices and guidance for how to engage with digital inclusion in the communities or organizations that you find yourselves in. So thank you for that. So a few things that you will either see or hear discussed when it comes to digital inclusion. So the digital divide is the issue. What that means is that the digital divide is the gap between those who have affordable access, skills, and support to effectively engage online and those who do not. And so the digital divide has actually grown in recent years. We like to think of technology as something that can be the great equalizer, and in many ways it's beautiful and it can. And as technology evolves, that means that people have to become skilled and get access to the new technologies to be able to benefit from them, which actually means that the gap can widen instead of, us getting to a point where that gap is filled. Now, the goal where we want to get with digital inclusion work is digital equity. And digital equity is simply a reality in which all individuals and communities have the information technology skills and access that's needed for full and meaningful inclusion and participation in their societies, in their economies, in workforce, and in family life. And so there's a lot that digital equity encompasses, and that's the work of digital inclusion. And so a lot of folks are doing digital inclusion work without actually realizing that it falls under the umbrella of digital inclusion. So the digital divide is the issue, digital equity is the goal we're working towards, and digital inclusion is the work to get there. So I wanted to start by simply mentioning that many of us, do me a favor, has anyone in here been trained in change management or is familiar with change management? Can you give me a thumbs up if you fit that description? All right. I'm not seeing anyone. So change management is simply practices and skills that are developed around helping facilitate change. As many of us know, change can be challenging, and oftentimes the people side of change can be even more complicated than the process side of change. But like any other type of change that exists, the way that we sort of get from this digital divide to this place of digital equity is by understanding that change starts with awareness, desire, and knowledge. And so basically for digital inclusion, we're focusing today on awareness and knowledge. My hope is that it will build a desire for you to want to learn more, and then focusing on the processes and the actual changes themselves in systems is where we might go with the conversation. So really quick, just to make everyone aware, I'm working at home and I have 3 monitors. So if you see me moving from side to side, that's the only reason that that's happening. It's not because I'm not paying attention. But I want to pop a few things up on the screen. And this is going to look like a lot, but we'll read through it together. We'll read through it together, excuse me. So, all right, let me ask you a question before we put those items up there. And that will help us sort of get into a frame of mind to talk about the things that we're going to see on the screen next. So my next question, and if you don't mind just popping it into the chat, is where do you go or where do you send folks for free or low-cost devices, for tech support, or for digital skills training? So there's no right or wrong answer here. Just pop into the chat that for those 3 things, low-cost devices, tech support, and digital skills training, where would you direct someone to go? Local library, absolutely. Libraries are harbingers of ushering residents forward. Thanks, John. I appreciate that comment. Where else might you send folks? School districts, libraries, or the tech department? Absolutely. Anybody have anything else to add? Oh yeah, absolutely, Margarita. For tech training, Udemy, they have good sales on courses. You can send folks to YouTube to learn things. Yep, absolutely. Definitely the research through Google. Yes, that's a great comment in the chat. So the research through Google is something that I still use all the time. I don't have a background in IT. I actually come from 15 plus years in higher education, where I was an assistant, an associate professor, and then an academic dean. And so I moved into information technology because what I saw, and this ties into DJ, what you're saying here, what I saw was that local universities have so much that they do for students and so much they can do for communities, but so much change needs to happen at policy levels and systemic levels. And so that's why I ended up transitioning and pivoting into local government and the work that I do. So these are all fantastic responses for where we can send folks when they have need. Many of these things that we're recommending rely on certain other things to be in place. For example, let's talk about local library for a second. So if we're sending someone to a local library, we're making an assumption that they can access that library in one of a few ways. They are able-bodied enough to get to that library and access the information, and or they have access to devices at home where they can engage with their local library. So those are two things that rely on that. School districts, libraries, or the tech department are kind of the same, right? For training, again, a lot of the places that we would send people for that do tend to be online places. And so if people aren't feeling comfortable or familiar with the internet or with how to search for particular things, if people don't feel like they have the ability to comfortably and safely do a Google search, which not everybody feels they do, then that can be really challenging. And then local university offerings are really accessible for students a lot of the times, but many people in a lot of different communities don't actually know a lot about what their local universities are doing. And so there's just these opportunities that exist for us to help get folks where they need to be. So as we think about digital inclusion, I'd love if we can think about it in terms of our own needs and the needs of the people we see around us. So here's that slide that I talked about that's got a lot on it. And when we talk about the different needs that folks have, oh, I apologize, y'all, that slide is actually missing. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about it for a second. So a lot of the answers you just gave can apply to the things that we would have talked about. So for example, an issue of digital inclusion can be something like you have elderly neighbors and they are not regularly seeing a physician because they have to go online to make an appointment and they don't have internet service, or they don't feel comfortable using it, or they don't have a home computer or smartphone. So thinking about where you might send those folks and if a resource actually exists for them. Maybe you are an educator and you have a student who comes to you and tells you, like we saw with a lot of the pandemic, that they want to do their homework, but their homework requires them not just to have a device, but to have a reliable internet connection, and their home or farm doesn't have that. And so, and their parents can't afford to get it for them. And so you might see what I saw some of as an educator during the pandemic, which is students going to their local McDonald's parking lot to try and attend classes and engage in work. Maybe you're someone who has a work colleague who your organization didn't necessarily do a lot of training ahead of time for a new technology that they were adopting, maybe a new software. At the city, we just switched to Microsoft 365. So we went from Microsoft 2010 to 365, and that was a huge transition, and it took a lot of training and guiding people through the process. Maybe you have a colleague that doesn't know how to use a new technology, and because of that, they're falling behind at work. Where might you send them for resources? All of these things fall under the work of digital inclusion, beyond just policy making and systemic change advocacy and activism. There are these things that we engage with on a regular basis that we don't tend to think are digital inclusion, but actually are. All right, so we'll come back to the slides. Again, apologies for that discrepancy. I want to talk about where digital inclusion has been, because it's this phrase that's actually becoming really popular in conversations in tech magazines and in a lot of technology forums and even in government forums and government spaces. So in the 1990s and 2010s, digital inclusion was what we referred to as this three-pronged stool. So the whole premise of the stool is that digital inclusion is propped up, the seat is propped up by these three things. First of all was internet access, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s. This became a huge issue because people started to realize the importance of the internet, which now only 20 to 30 years later, we see was completely accurate, and we've surpassed where we thought we might even be. So internet access at home was a big part of it. Also a focus on getting folks computers in the home. We like to think that everybody has a computer at home. I hear this all the time. Folks who say, well, everyone has a laptop, they could just do X. And the reality of the situation is not everybody does. Or maybe you've got a family of 8 that are sharing one laptop together. And maybe that's the laptop provided by the school because the parents can't necessarily afford to get a laptop. Maybe it's a computer device, back in the early 2000s, cell phone service wasn't necessarily tied closely to browsing on the internet. Now we have smartphones. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then from the 1990s through the 2010s, digital inclusion also focused on digital literacy. Okay, we're trying to get folks this access. We're getting them the devices. How do we teach them how to use this stuff? So it was this three-pronged stool, and that's what policy change, data collection, systemic change, and mass collaboration. And I say mass collaboration all the way from Congress to community partnerships, organizations that were developed for the sole purpose and task force of getting these things to folks in local communities. And what we've seen since the 2010s, which is only 4 years ago, is a massive shift in what digital inclusion encompasses. So we are now seeing that because of the changes that we're seeing in technology, digital inclusion means a whole lot more. It's no longer just about internet, device, know how to use it, right? We are now focusing on digital equity. We're focusing on the ability to make sure not just that people have access, but that they actually adopt the things that are being presented to them. And we've moved away, honestly, from conversations about the need for broadband, though there's still a need. There is still a need, and in rural Wisconsin, there are a lot of areas, we'll talk about that in a little bit, that still do not have access to reliable, high-speed broadband or wired internet. But a lot of the conversation, because some of that is being rectified with these infrastructure dollars that have come in from the federal government and state governments have filtered down, the focus is going to be on adoption. So you have all these people who didn't have access before now, and they've lived without it. Now, how do we get them to adopt and feel comfortable and safe with these things, right? That's a huge part of digital equity, making sure that everyone has a place at the table. The pandemic changed everything, and I think everybody that's here today knows that. So the pandemic really highlighted, all it did was serve to highlight the gaps that existed, and it accelerated the pace at which the government responded by trying to put funding into more digital inclusion efforts. So now digital literacy isn't just about knowing how to surf the internet and knowing how to use devices. It's also about how do we teach people to engage in online and digital spaces with critical thinking and critical evaluation. It's about cybersecurity, which I know is a huge issue for those of us that are in IT and even those outside IT, but it's something that we in IT are grappling with a lot. Digital literacy is also cultural and social understanding of how to be in digital spaces, of understanding how to present ourselves, and of understanding how to interpret others in digital spaces. It's about collaboration. So learning how to use digital spaces to work with others, that's a huge part of digital literacy. Knowing how to curate, how to search for, how to engage with information in a meaningful way. And by meaningful, I simply mean knowing what search terms to use when you're trying to find the information that you need, knowing and understanding whether or not the information is misinformation or accurate information, knowing how to understand what a source is and why sources matter. All of those things are a part of it. So we have a lot of other things beyond just the practical how to use my device skills. And we still have a large pocket of the population, at least from my experience here in Wisconsin and then up in Michigan, in the UP of Michigan, which is where I was before I came down to Madison. From my experience, we have a lot of folks who still are learning how to use their devices. And we like to think that the digital divide is really about oftentimes it does disproportionately impact people of color, marginalized communities. That is 100% true. We also see the greatest digital divide between folks from older generations and younger generations. And we like to make a lot of assumptions about folks when it comes to their digital abilities. Give me a thumbs up if you've heard the term digital native before. And does someone want to tell me what that is? Anyone feeling like speaking up, being brave? You're not brave if you don't speak up. What's a digital native? DJ, yes, in the chat. Great, Google. Google has answered our question. Fantastic, DJ. Thanks for bringing that to us. So the term digital native describes a person who's grown up in the information age. So it's a person who essentially has spent most of their lives with devices being a part of their world. So I'm sure we have a lot of folks here today that have different backgrounds. Everyone do me a favor, pop into the chat the age that you were. This is not, I'm not gonna ask you to identify how old you are now, but pop into the chat the age that you were when you got your first cell phone. Pop it into the chat. All right, I'm seeing 21, 20, 19, 17, 11, 19, sometime in the 20s. Yes. 13. That's fantastic, Michaela. 13 because they were having a buy two, get two free deal. So access, right? Free or low cost. 18. Yeah. Yeah. And some of these responses, for a wider audience, I've asked that question before, and I have had respondents who have said, I've never owned a cell phone. And I've had respondents who have said, I don't remember when I got it because it was always there. And so we're all somewhere in the middle. All right. But digital natives, we make a lot of assumptions that because especially young people have grown up with cell phones, and then folks, millennials have been using cell phones for so long that they know how to operate them. But that's just the start. So operating them does not mean that they can use them to engage and participate in a meaningful way in society and in local government and in education. We're seeing that. And it doesn't mean that they can translate skills into those spaces that they would learn in offline spaces, or that we can translate what those digital natives are learning in online spaces to their offline spaces, right? We hear a lot of stories, at least let me rephrase that. I heard a lot of stories in higher education about how, throw in any stereotype, young people today, they just don't know how to interact with each other. They don't know how to talk because they're so used to being on their devices. That can be true. It can also be equally true that they use their devices for 3 or 4 things and not much else. And so those 3 or 4 things they could be phenomenal at, but they may not necessarily know how to do an Excel spreadsheet. They might not necessarily know how to attend a Zoom meeting, right? So we make a lot of assumptions about digital natives, and digital literacy extends all the way from digital natives, right? Needing to elevate those skills, needing to elevate those practices, from young people all the way up to older individuals who, in many cases, have just in the last few years during the pandemic also had to learn how to engage in digital spaces. So digital inclusion encompasses all of that. Now, beyond the three-legged stool, the internet access, so broadband access is what we're really focused on, devices and digital literacy. There are a lot of focuses nowadays. There are 5 pillars, but there's a lot of focus on infusing funds in so that we can get everybody not just at a usable internet speed, but at an adequate and fast internet speed. So the FCC I think just this year, updated their benchmark, and I believe the previous benchmark was from sometime in the early 2020s or late 2010s. But the previous benchmark was that, all broadband internet had to be 25 megabits per second download speed and 3 megabits per second upload speed. And now, just this year, they've changed that to be 100 megabytes of download speed and 20 megabytes of upload speed. And the Internet for All program, which has infused funding dollars into that, and the Digital Equity Act have infused funding dollars into building out a broadband infrastructure in the state of Wisconsin. The Public Service Commission is doing a lot of work in that area. And it's infused it out to get broadband at the 100 megabytes per second speed out to communities that don't already have it. And a little bit later, if we have time, I'll show you their broadband map, because that can help you identify some of the gaps that exist with digital inclusion in your own communities. Oftentimes we are enmeshed in the work that we do on a daily basis. And so that's sort of where our focus lies, without understanding that even if we're in a business, local government, education, whatever it might be that we find ourselves in for work each day, that has capacity to impact our communities in ways that we may not realize. So understanding what your community has access to is really important. And all of these things are updates that we're seeing related to digital inclusion. And you'll notice that the shift just in the last 4 years has gone from get access to internet and devices, teach people how to use them, which is pretty profound back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And just in the last 4 years, it's shifted to everything that you see on your screen right now. There's a lot of work to be done, but the good news is that there's ways that we can engage in that work, and that we can see change happen. And so we'll talk about that after we talk about the different pillars of digital inclusion as it exists today. I want to take pause for a second and hear from anybody who has any questions, any comments. Maybe give me a thumbs up if you're good with the pace so far. Feel free to let me know if you'd like to get into the meat of how to build digital equity for the future. I'm seeing some thumbs up. No questions or comments? All right, I'll keep talking. I could talk about this stuff all day long. I do. All right, so today's pillars of digital inclusion. You'll still hear the three-legged stool talked about a lot, but I challenge that stool a little bit, because again, we're not in a place anymore where all we need is for people to get on the internet, get devices to do it, and know how to use it. It's so much more complex than that. And so the pillars of digital inclusion as they exist today are actually considered to be 5-fold, but each of these pillars encompasses a million different things. So we'll go through them one by one, all right? The first pillar of digital inclusion as it exists today is a traditional one as well, and that's connectivity. So affordable and reliable broadband internet at high speeds, right? Having access to what the FCC says should be the standard, 100 megabytes per second of download speed and 20 megabytes per second of upload speed, having access to that in the spaces we find ourselves regularly is important because we need that to participate in a digital world. The second pillar is still access, right? We need affordable and reliable technology. And that includes computers, laptops, tablets, smartphones, anything that's necessary for participation. And beyond that, anything that will afford us the opportunity to elevate our experience in life. So we like to think, well, if everyone just has a laptop, that's all they need technically to get by. And sure, many folks could just get by with, let's say, a laptop and a smartphone. I've heard folks say, well, no one needs a tablet if you have a laptop and a smartphone. It's just sort of a luxury. And the reality of the situation is these things help people feel more comfortable in spaces, and it gives them access to doing more things than they'd be able to do otherwise. I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming years, I mean, we're seeing such massive changes in AI. I could do a whole other talk about digital inclusion and AI, and maybe at some point I'll try to. But AI has changed everything. And again, folks talk about these technologies as though they are the great equalizer. And again, they are an equalizer. They also present opportunities for the gap to widen between people who have access and know how to use it and can engage in a meaningful way with it and those who don't. So connectivity and access still matter, but they matter on a much grander scale nowadays. The third pillar of digital inclusion, the thing that keeps digital inclusion the roof, let's say the roof over our heads, is adoption and tech support. So adoption and tech support really require access and connection that people trust. And I know this was a big conversation for this WiscNet community at the WiscNet conference. We talked a lot about cybersecurity and what that looks like, and having a more secure network, having more secure systems, having more secure trainings. So having trust and access to that ongoing support. And beyond that, it's really important for people to adopt the support that's provided for them. And so that's why in the beginning of our conversation today, we talked a little bit about the first stages of change management, right? That awareness, that desire to change, that knowledge of what things could be like if we did change. And what that ties closely into is this adoption piece. You can have 20 people staffing a help desk. If people don't know how to access that help desk, or people don't know the questions to ask when they call the help desk, or maybe that help desk isn't trained in working with people who don't speak English, or people who don't use computer, quote unquote, speak, then they're not going to be likely to keep moving through the process of adopting the new tool. Let me see, throw me a thumbs up in the Zoom if you have ever followed instructions for a new piece of technology and almost given up because you followed the instructions to the T and it did not work the way that it was supposed to. Show me a thumbs up if that's ever happened to you. Several folks. Yes, yes, right? And that can cause us, some people don't necessarily have capacity or time or resources to push through that feeling, that barrier of, oh, I've had enough. I feel that way when I put together IKEA furniture. That is, you can really tell who someone is when they're trying to put together a piece of IKEA furniture or set up a new technology. Because we all our primal selves come out, right? It's fight or flight. I've been told I need this thing to survive. I've been told I need this thing to thrive, not just to survive, but also to thrive. And I don't have the tools and resources to make it work for me, nor do I have the desire because I'm so frustrated. Or maybe I don't have the desire because I've tried other things in the past and they haven't worked for me. So how can I trust that what you're telling is going to work for me is actually going to work for me? So we still see that areas that have high connectivity, like Madison, for example, the work that I do is confined to the walls of the City of Madison, though I do a lot of collaborating with folks around the county and around the state and around the country. But the work that I focus on a daily basis, we have high connectivity here in Madison. We have broadband to each pocket of the community, and people have access to free devices via our library systems, if they have the resources to get that access, right? So part of the struggle in many pockets of our community is actually the adoption piece. It's getting people to understand how to use the technology to help elevate their daily lived experience. And that's what's going to help them keep pace with how technology is changing. And so that's one of the barriers that we really see here in the city of Madison. You might see other barriers in your community, and we'll talk a little bit about how to identify those barriers if we get time later on. The fourth pillar for digital inclusion is these digital skills, right? We call it digital literacy. And essentially, this is just effective technology use. What's effective use for one audience may not be effective use for another audience. So oftentimes these technologies are built and we imagine all of the things that they can do to help change people's lives. But many people don't have, again, the time, the resources, and by resources, I mean money, I mean motivation, right? The internal intrinsic motivation to actually adopt something that's new. Change is hard. And we live in a society where more and more is demanded of people each day because of digital spaces. Lots of people are experiencing burnout because digital access has been beautiful, and it's also presented a lot of struggles in terms of having to manage so much at any given time. And so because of that, we see folks who maybe use technology, but don't really care to know how to use it in a way that's going to be more meaningful for them. They also may not know how to use it in a way that's going to be more secure. And security is a huge part of digital skills. Training people, helping people arrive at a space where they know how to differentiate if something is a phishing scam, where they know how to differentiate, you know, how to judge an email address based solely on what's written in the email address itself, right? These are little things that people who are in IT, people who are highly educated, and people who have worked in spaces that focus on technology, these are things we've known for a long time. But there are entire groups of the people we engage with on a regular basis who don't have the basic understandings we do. And that's just a huge part of digital inclusion, is bringing not just bringing everyone to the table, but giving them a place there to thrive and to be part of the input that helps us improve what we're doing technology wise. And so digital skills is really a pocket of digital inclusion that empowers users. It's the empowerment piece. You have the access, you have the resources, you have the motivation. Now we're going to elevate, because you're going to be empowered to actually engage with the things that we've brought you to the table to engage with. And it's going to be in a way that works for you, which may not be the way that works for the person next to you. So those are things that we have to keep in mind when it comes to digital skills. And the fifth pillar for digital inclusion is one that's been relatively new in terms of being added to digital inclusion spaces. And the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, the NDIA, is an organization that really has become the driver of digital inclusion policy, definitions, and guidance. And so I recommend that if anyone's interested in learning more, that you visit the National Digital Inclusion Alliance's website and go through what they offer. But content and accessibility is something that they're naming as focal points that we have to consider moving forward, as much as we consider security, right? So being able to say that everything we've developed has been developed with an intentional design and language that's inclusive of all experiences. It's a daunting task. And I know that in my time as an educator, it could be challenging to try and facilitate something. It's a recipe for burnout to try and facilitate something that is going to reach every single student in the unique way that they learn. Here, do me a favor. How many folks on this call are in an education space, whether you're teaching or not? Give me a thumbs up if you're in an education space. Seeing a few folks. Yeah. Yeah. This kind of intentionality can be challenging. The goal is to keep working at it. right? To consider the fact that now that people are connected, now that they have access, now that they're choosing to adopt it and they have tech support to do so safely and comfortably, and in iterations as updates come out and other things happen, and we've given them the skills, it's essential that everything that we do in those digital spaces is accessible, from accessible design to language choice to understanding audiences and their needs for these technologies that we're using, uh, to plain language, right? So we've got standards in a lot of local government spaces. How many folks that are joining us today are in local government or state government or even federal government? You give me a thumbs up if we got anyone. All right. Got at least one person, right? So there's this movement towards plain language. Does anyone know what plain language is? If we say, put that in plain language, what does it mean? Feel free to pop it in the chat or unmute yourself. Thanks, DJ. Yeah. Understandable by all or most. At the City of Madison, we have adopted, in terms of when we're interacting with our residents, we've adopted the federal government standard of 8th grade reading level. 10th grade is considered pretty standard reading level just outside of those spaces. But many of us, particularly folks who come from a background where they've been highly educated, and by highly educated, I mean they've gone on to get education beyond that of high school, we talk and we write in ways that are not necessarily accessible for the average person, for a person whose first language is not English, for a person who did not, go on to get the same kind of education. And so learning to talk about technology and learning to engage in the spaces that we're in ways that are accessible language wise for everyone is really important. Making sure that we understand the people that are engaging with our products, our services, right? Or the folks in our community, making sure we understand what their language needs are. If their language, if their primary language may not be English, or we've got pockets of our communities who their first language isn't English, then chances are there are going to be kids that we're educating, right, from those pockets of the community, or we're going to need to be able to engage with those folks in the community in a meaningful way. And to do that, to help elevate their experience, their lived experience, we have to be able to connect with them through language access. I'm talking about a lot of things here with these pillars of digital inclusion that take time, take money, take resources, take facilitation. And so I just want to take a moment and hold space to recognize that. But I think awareness of what we could be doing to make participation in daily life more meaningful through our technology and through our digital spaces is half the battle. Just being aware of how things exist today and being aware of what we might be able to do to shift things. Or as we engage in our daily work, making sure that what stays in our mind is this thing that I'm doing that's related to digital anything? Is it inclusive? Okay, what does that mean? Do people have ways to access it? Do people want to and know how to adopt it? Can they use it in meaningful and elevating ways? Can they be empowered to do that? And will it reach everyone, right? Those are just things that we can be keeping in mind with everything that we build and everything that we do. All right, so with the pillars of digital inclusion, I think if we've got folks on here who are from government, education, I think a few folks probably from industry. Can you give me a thumbs up if you're joining us from industry or an organization today? Maybe you work at a help desk or you're a small business owner. All right. Yep, got some folks. Okay. So we understand that these pillars, these giant things that we just spent a lot of time talking about, we understand that they're only as effective as the systems they find themselves in. So when we think about the 5 pillars of digital inclusion, as we think about how we can elevate everyone's experience and participation, in a meaningful way, there are a few things that go into informing decisions we make about the products that we're producing, about the things that we're teaching, the curriculum we're designing, about the ways in which we're shifting our library resources. All of those things are impacted by data, policy change, system change, and collaboration. So data is absolutely essential when it comes to digital inclusion. We can't talk about divides and gaps that exist without being able to identify what those gaps are. And I don't know that we'll have time to get to it today. I would be happy with anyone who is here today or anyone that watches this later who's interested in learning more about ways to help to get involved with and or start digital inclusion efforts in your local community or maybe even just within your organization. Then I'm happy to provide some resources for you that lay out what the future of digital inclusion looks like. But right now, to implement these pillars, we've got to have good data about the gaps. And there are a few questions you can be asking before even thinking about starting a program. So I live in Madison. We're this beautiful community of activists. I did my PhD here years ago and then moved away for higher education and then came back for this job. And I will tell you what, we have so many wonderful people who are activists in our community, and people who are activists are activated to make change happen. And because of that, they see a need, whether it's a friend's need, a family member's need, something they passed on the street, something they heard about, right? We have lots of folks that are ready to jump in and fill a need. What we don't have is a lot of communication and a lot of broader picture understanding of what the needs are, because we've got lots of folks who are starting things that actually already exist in local areas, but they're just either not talked about, advertised well, or we don't have the data, to show that the need is beyond just one family member yet. And so one of the biggest tasks that we've been doing here in the city of Madison is getting a lay of the land and understanding based on data what the community needs currently are. And part of that has been mapping out an ecosystem. And we have an ecosystem map, and we're going to start posting some of it to our local library sites based on data that we've received and what we've done to examine what's out there already in the city of Madison as resources for low-cost internet, resources for devices, resources for digital skills training. And so that data is able to inform, that ecosystem map is able to inform what we can make as recommendations for filling needs moving forward. But without that data, we can't make skilled recommendations, right? We can't advocate for change, for policy change, for systemic change for individuals. So that data is vitally important. So making sure that all of the change we're activating is based in data that we have from the people who are members of the communities we're trying to serve is important. We've got to remember part of digital inclusion is nothing for us without us. So we should have folks at the table who are part of those communities before making decisions about them. Policy change and systems change. This is a beast. Anyone who's joining today from education, local government, those can be difficult systems to wade through, and things take a lot of time. Again, the pandemic was a fabulous accelerator for digital equity. It caused things to get infused, resources to get infused into systems a lot faster. But policy change is slow and hard. The Affordable Connectivity Program, an internet discount program, went away for folks this year. So it's an internet discount program for low-income households. It went away, and we haven't been able to get any policy in Congress that re-ups that internet discount for folks. And so we're having to look at other ways that people can get low-cost internet to their homes. Systems change can be challenging because there's ways that we're used to doing things, and when we build more that we have to consider into that, it becomes really unwieldy and cumbersome and hard. So being iterative, creating sustainable change, being slow and deliberate about the things that we're doing and the changes that we're making and the ways in which we're shifting our systems is really important. But the biggest piece is those collaborations. You can't get the data, you can't make the policy change, and you can't realize the systems change without collaboration. So a big push in the field of digital inclusion right now, and in folks who work in this sector, is on collaboration and building coalitions. One thing I want to point out, and then I know that we've got some announcements and we'll wrap up a little bit, is that we do have a digital equity stakeholders group here in the state of Wisconsin. It's for anyone who is interested in either knowing more about digital inclusion and digital equity, what's happening in the state of Wisconsin, anyone who wants to hear about grant opportunities. There are a lot of grants out there right now for digital inclusion work, particularly around collaborations and coalitions. And it's a space to learn what other people in your communities and other communities around the state are doing. So you can go to the Public Service Commission's website, or if you are able to, you can pop into the Google search, Public Service Commission Digital Equity Stakeholders Group, and it will take you to instructions for how to join that group. And that is a wonderful place to learn what's happening and to help fill some of those gaps, see where they're being filled, and to meet people you can connect with, to engage with, and sort of come up with some innovative solutions for some of these struggles that you might see in your community. So I have lots more slides. I think we're going to finish up there for today. And my hope is that if you have enjoyed this very, very, very brief introduction to the whole world that is digital inclusion, that you will let us know in your feedback what you enjoyed, and that you'll also let us know what you might be interested in hearing more about as WiscNet follows up with you. So I really thank you all for your time and your engagement today. And yeah, I think that's all that I have.
Thank you, Cass. And we, again, want to say thank you for this wonderful presentation on this subject that I feel like quite often is overlooked by others. And I know you can speak about it all day long and maybe then some. And at this point, let's open it for questions. We encourage you to unmute and ask it, or you can leave your question in the chat as well. And while people are thinking or typing up their questions, we would like to announce, well, not announce, but advertise, I suppose, our next Teach and Learn. We are working on a pop-up meeting. Possibly it'll happen on July 18th, but we still need for certain pieces of puzzle to fall in together. So keep an eye on our communication. Right. I don't see any questions in the chat. And no one's too eager to unmute as well.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Is that allowed?
Yes.
Absolutely.
All right, fantastic. So just for the folks who are joining us today who feel comfortable unmuting or popping into the chat, what was your impetus for joining today? And it's not a loaded question. There's no right or wrong answer. Just when you saw this topic, what was it that made you decide to devote this hour of your time today to watching it? And or for those of you that are watching the recording, what is it that made you find the space and time to go online, seek it out, and watch it?
I'll start. When I saw the subject, and I was like, I know what those words mean separately, but combined together. It was very curious to me, and I learned a lot. I see John unmuted.
Yeah, good morning, Cass. To answer your question, my name is John Parrish. I'm with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. Currently, our focus is with access, the access part of the puzzle, especially as it relates to the broadband equity access and deployment, the BEAD program. But once we work through the access piece of the puzzle, we will want to kind of graduate then into more of the digital inclusion and equity parts of the puzzle. So we're just trying to get ahead of the game, looking ahead down the road.
Thank you for sharing that, John. I really appreciate that. And that is another resource for folks on this call, the UW Extension. They have a website that's devoted to digital inclusion and to digital equity and to some of this broadband deployment in the rural parts of Wisconsin. So if you find yourselves in those communities, it's a great great resource for that. So thank you, John. And then I see DJ in the chat. I'm sure this falls under the accessibility pillar, but can you talk through the challenges or opportunities with digital equity for folks with disabilities? Oof, we've only got 6 minutes here, DJ. I will do my best to answer that. For anyone who works in a government entity, the Department of Justice has passed down guidance that all websites moving forward must comply with WCAG, which is Web Accessibility Content Guidelines, I think is what it stands for, but WCAG 2.1 AA, which was actually developed, I think those guidelines were developed 10 years ago. Most recent update was last year, 2023, and they've now moved to guidance for 2.2, but the federal government's requiring that. So opportunities are that if you work for an entity that does not have a website or web spaces, digital spaces that are public facing, that are accessible according to those guidelines, then the DOJ is going to be reviewing sites starting in April of 2026. So that's an opportunity between now and 2026 to elevate what you're offering. And WCAG is a wonderful resource when it comes to websites. There's so much with assistive technologies that's out there when it comes to digital inclusion. And so part of what I do at the city too is facilitate assistive technologies for individuals in the workplace who have accommodations. WiscTech does great work with assistive technologies and focusing on accessibility for folks who are disabled. And there's a lot of other resources out there as well. I think the challenges and the opportunities honestly stay the same as they have for years, which is as technology evolves, people who have access have more opportunity. People who don't have the same kinds of access have to work harder to get that opportunity. So those are challenges that we're going to continue to face. We're going to see it with AI. We're going to see it with cybersecurity. We're going to see it with workplace policies and accessibility compliance. So, disability is a very large term, and there's a lot of things I could talk about with different types of disability, but that's the answer I have for that right now, DJ. And it looks like John popped in the chat the link to the broadband toolkit from the UW.
Wonderful. Does anyone else have any last minute questions? Cass, I'm not sure if you want to pop your contact info into the chat at all. So in case anyone wants to reach out with any more specific questions or anything like that. We'll also send the chat transcript along with the recording to everyone so that they have all of this. And that recording will be sent out most likely in the next week. I'm on vacation, and I think so is our communication person. So you'll get that recording within the next week or so. But otherwise, thank you so much, Cass, for joining us and talking all about digital inclusion. I know that it was just kind of just breaching the surface of what all there is. So potentially even getting a follow-up teach and learn schedule just to chat a little more about what we didn't get into. Yeah, so if no one else has anything, then we will wrap up. But yeah, thank you all for joining.